That brings us to the exercise for part 8. So same build command as before. In this case, we have login not working. So we need to make login work. Currently, it doesn't actually send an HTTP request to the server. And we're going to, sorry, not login, sign up. So we're going to go to page register and resolve the to-dos in here. Okay. So here we can see a number of ingredients that we just talked about in the slides. So one is request body. Sorry, that's actually a new one. We can see response decoder, which is a decoder viewer. Viewer is the term for the currently logged in user in this application, so it means like the current user. So this could have also been current user, but the name I chose to go with was viewer. So this is a decoder. The http.body is something that http.post requires. We don't need to worry about how that's put together. It's essentially the same thing as get, except that it requires that HTTP body, which we have already put together in this example. So our job here is to create an HTTP request value that represents a post to API/users. Here's the documentation for HTTP post. At this point, we've learned enough about Elm that we can just go read this documentation and actually learn how this function works, what we need to pass it, and how to get it working without actually having been taught it explicitly. This is going to become an increasingly important skill to use as you're working through Elm because quite often the solution to the problem is to visit the package website for whatever it is you're working with and learn how these things work by just reading the documentation about them. And the types are quite often the most important thing in that because they tell you essentially what is going to be necessary to pass this thing to get it to work properly. Quite often in Elm, if you successfully get the types to work out, in other words, you get the compiler satisfied, it just works the first time you try it. And I think that's likely to be the case here. Okay. There's also a thing here that we have not seen before called debug.todo. So what does that thing do? So debug.todo is a function that has a very unusual type. In fact, it's the only place in Elm where this type appears in any of the standard libraries. And basically, debug.todo will type check with anything. And if you ever execute this, it will crash. So you might be wondering, how can we have like a function in Elm that crashes when Elm's whole thing is like no runtime exceptions? Like what's the deal with that? And the name gives you a clue. This is intended for debugging and sort of like as a to-do when you get to a point where you're like, I want to come back to this later. Just like compile for now. I will fix this later. Don't worry about it, and I'll circle back to it later. Important feature of this is that when you're building for production mode and you give Elm make the -- optimize flag, which is to say actually like compact your assets and give me those small assets that I want to deploy to production, it will refuse to compile if you left any of these in your code. That's why I say no production runtime exceptions. Also, that feature didn't always exist in Elm. Back in the day, it was the case that you could leave these in and the compiler would not yell at you when you were building for production. That's the source of the only runtime exceptions we ever got. We left some of these in our code and accidentally hit them in production. But fortunately, now if I try to build with optimize while I still have this to do in there, it's not going to work. So as an example of that, if I compile this, that will work just fine, and we can be unblocked and continue working on this. As soon as I add -- optimize, oops, did I not spell that right? Oh, I put it on after a new line. Okay, debug remnants. There are uses of the debug module in the following modules. The optimize flag only works if all of them are removed. This is something that is safe to use for development when we want to sort of say, you know what, I want to circle back to this later. I don't want to resolve these compiler errors yet. But it's not something that's going to bite you in production as long as you're using the optimize flag in production, which of course is always what you want to be using anyway, because who wouldn't want smaller assets? All right. So that's our request. And then finally, we have this command. So the command is what's going to actually get returned from update in addition to our model. And to build this command using the request, the ingredients that we're going to need to use are this thing, as well as we're going to need to specify the message variant that's going to handle those two possibilities of either it succeeded or it failed.